December 1945. The air in Tokyo bites with the icy grip of a winter that offers no comfort. The war is over, but for the people of Japan, the suffering is far from finished. The city, a once vibrant metropolis, is now a skeletal ruin, a graveyard of dreams and ambitions. We find ourselves in a landscape of ash and twisted metal, a place where hunger gnaws at the very soul. Here, in the ruins of what was once their home, a group of Japanese children huddle together. Their clothes are tattered, their faces smudged with soot, and their eyes, the windows to their young spirits, are haunted by a silent, profound emptiness. They are the forgotten victims of a war that has stolen their childhood and left them with nothing but the gnawing ache of starvation. One boy, no more than 6, stares at his hollowed-out hands, his stomach a tight knot of pain. He looks up as a rumble shakes the ground, not a sound of bombs, but the metallic roar of an American convoy. The children flinch, their small bodies tense with fear, their minds still trapped in a war that has ended for everyone but them. Then a voice cuts through the tension. "Hey, kid!" it calls out. A young American soldier with a kind, worried face steps out, holding something in his hand. The children's fear turns to confusion, then disbelief, as the soldier extends his hand, offering not a weapon, but a symbol of peace, a Hershey's chocolate bar. The world of 1945 was a study in contrasts, a tableau of triumph and tragedy, of rebuilding and ruin. For the Allied forces, victory was a sweet, long-awaited taste. For Japan, it was the bitter end of an era, a searing defeat that left the nation on its knees. The months following the surrender in August 1945 were a period of immense upheaval, a time of reckoning and profound uncertainty. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, arrived in Japan with a monumental task: to occupy, demilitarize, and rebuild a shattered nation. His mission was not merely one of control, but of transformation. The goal was to dismantle the militaristic empire and plant the seeds of democracy. But before any grand political or economic reforms could take root, a more fundamental crisis had to be addressed: the sheer, overwhelming devastation. Japan was a nation in ruin. The relentless B-29 firebombing raids had reduced cities like Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka to charred wastelands. The infrastructure was crippled, factories were rubble, and the agricultural system was in disarray. Food was scarce and the black market thrived, but for most, even that was out of reach. For the average Japanese citizen, survival was a daily struggle, a relentless battle against hunger and despair. In this bleak landscape, the American occupation forces arrived. Their presence was a source of deep anxiety and fear for the Japanese people. They had been told for years that the Americans were savage demons, barbarians who would rape, pillage, and enslave them. The propaganda of the Imperial Army had been a constant drumbeat of hatred and fear, and the surrender had done little to quell those deeply ingrained beliefs. Japanese families hid their daughters and prepared for the worst. The children in particular were terrified. They had grown up with the constant threat of air raids, the sight of their cities burning, and the tales of enemy cruelty. The sight of an American soldier, in their green uniform and steel helmet, was a terrifying one, a living embodiment of the enemy who had brought so much destruction to their lives. Yet for all the fear, there was also a desperate, unspoken need. The hunger was a constant physical presence, a gnawing ache that overshadowed all other emotions. It was a silent, universal language that transcended national borders and old hatreds. In the ruins of Tokyo, in the shadow of Mount Fuji, and in the bombed-out shell of Hiroshima, children with distended bellies and gaunt faces scoured the rubble for anything edible. A few stray kernels of rice, a rotten potato, or even weeds. These were the treasures they sought. They were the orphans of a war they had never asked for, left to fend for themselves in a world that had abandoned them. This was the scene a young American GI named James Thompson, a fresh-faced 19-year-old from Kansas, found himself in. James was a radio operator, part of a Signal Corps unit tasked with setting up communications infrastructure. He wasn't a combat veteran, but he had seen the horrors of war firsthand from the coded messages he'd received. Now he was seeing the human cost up close. His unit's convoy was making its way through a particularly desolate district of Tokyo, the streets littered with debris and the skeletal remains of buildings. He saw a group of children near what looked like the foundation of a house. They were thin, their clothes in rags, and they watched the convoy with a mixture of terror and curiosity. One little girl, no more than 4 years old, tripped and fell. She didn't cry. She just lay there, a small, still heap, her face buried in the dust. The sight of her, so helpless and so small, hit James with the force of a physical blow. It was the moment the war stopped being about strategy and enemy lines and became a deeply personal tragedy. James felt a lump form in his throat, a mix of anger and sorrow. He couldn't just drive by. He had to do something. Without thinking, he grabbed the small brown paper bag of rations he had in his pack. He unbuttoned the flap of the truck's canvas cover and slid out, his feet hitting the cold, hard ground with a soft thud. He started walking towards the children, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The children saw him coming. They froze, their eyes wide with fear. One of the older boys, maybe 10, grabbed the little girl and pulled her to her feet, his body a shield in front of her. He looked at James with defiance and hate, his small hands balled into fists. But James wasn't carrying a rifle. He was carrying a bag of hope, a few pieces of chocolate, a can of peaches, and a handful of crackers. He stopped a few feet away, holding the bag out. The boy's eyes flickered from James's face to the bag, a moment of profound internal conflict. Was this a trick, a trap? It was a moment of decision that would change not only the lives of these children, but also the course of the occupation itself. The silence hung heavy in the air, a thick, suffocating blanket of mistrust and fear. The older boy, Kenji, tightened his grip on his younger sister, Emmy, his small body rigid with defiance. His mind replayed the lessons of his father, a soldier who had died on Okinawa. Never trust the gaijin, his father had told him. They are devils with sweet smiles, and their hearts are as cold as ice. He had seen the fires in the sky, felt the ground shake with each bomb blast, and now here was one of the devils standing before him. But the gnawing hunger in his belly was a relentless torment, a pain that screamed louder than his fear. He looked at the paper bag in the American soldier's hand. The subtle rustle of the paper, the tantalizing scent of something sweet and unfamiliar, was a siren song to his starved senses. His sister Emmy pulled at his tattered jacket, her eyes, wide and pleading, fixed on the bag. She was too young to remember a time without hunger. For her, the world was a landscape of perpetual want. Her stomach, a constant source of pain, a hollow void that nothing seemed to fill. James, the young GI, stood there, his arm extended, his expression a mixture of apprehension and genuine concern. He knew he was a walking symbol of everything they had lost, everything they had been taught to hate. He had to break through that wall of fear. He took a small step forward, his voice gentle and low. "It's okay," he said, his words clumsy in their translation. "For you. Food." He pointed to the bag and then to the children, trying to convey his simple, clear intention. He didn't want to patronize them or make them feel like charity cases. He just wanted to help. He knelt slowly, deliberately, making himself smaller, less threatening. He carefully placed the paper bag on the ground, then stood up and took a few steps back, giving them space, a gesture of respect and trust. He wanted them to see that he was not a threat, that this was a gift, not a trap. Kenji's eyes never left the bag. He looked at the soldier, who was now standing at a respectful distance, his hands open and empty. The boy's heart was a drum of conflicting emotions. His father's words echoed in his mind, but the pain in his stomach, the silent plea in his sister's eyes, was a more powerful force. He finally relented. He took a tentative step forward, then another, his bare feet silent on the dusty ground. He reached the bag and knelt, his hands trembling. He carefully opened the top and peered inside. The sight was almost too much for him to bear. There was a can of peaches, its colorful label a splash of vibrant life in this gray, desolate world. There were small packets of crackers, and most miraculously of all, a dark, rectangular bar wrapped in silver foil. A Hershey's chocolate bar. He had never seen one before, but he knew what it was. It was a legend whispered in the bombed-out shelters, a mythical treat that only the Americans possessed. He carefully, reverently, took the chocolate bar out of the bag. He broke off a small piece and, with a silent, profound gesture of love, held it out to Emmy. Her eyes lit up, a small star of hope in their depths. She took the piece, her fingers small and delicate, and put it in her mouth. Her expression changed from one of vacant hunger to pure, unadulterated joy. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was the first time she had tasted real sugar in years. The other children who had been watching from a distance began to stir. They saw Kenji and Emmy sharing the food, and a new emotion began to replace the fear in their eyes: hope. One by one they started to approach, their movements slow and cautious, like small animals emerging from their burrows. James watched them, a profound sense of relief washing over him. He had broken through. He had extended a hand and they had taken it. He saw the same hunger and fear in their faces that he saw in the faces of his own younger siblings in Kansas. For a moment, the vast chasm of war and culture disappeared. They were just children, and he was just a man with some food to share. The scene was repeated countless times across the occupied country. American soldiers, seeing the abject poverty and hunger, reached into their own packs and shared their rations. They gave away K-rations, C-rations, chocolate bars, chewing gum, and canned fruit. These small, simple acts of kindness began to chip away at the walls of animosity and mistrust. The children became the first tentative bridge between two nations that had been mortal enemies just a few months earlier. They were the ones who saw not the uniform, not the enemy, but the man behind the uniform, the person who had given them a moment of comfort, a taste of sweetness, and a sliver of hope. James watched as Kenji and Emmy ate the peaches, their faces smeared with the sticky syrup. He saw the way the other children gathered around, not in fear, but in wonder and gratitude. He felt a profound shift within himself. This was not the war he had trained for. This was something else entirely. This was the beginning of peace. But what if these acts of kindness were not enough? What if the institutionalized hatred and the vast cultural differences proved too great to overcome? The next few months would be a test of whether a few shared rations could truly mend the wounds of a world war. The story of James and the children was not an isolated incident. It was a microcosm of a much larger, more profound transformation taking place across Japan. As more and more American GIs encountered the stark reality of the Japanese people's suffering, a shift in mindset began to occur. The image of the enemy, so carefully constructed by wartime propaganda, began to crumble, replaced by the human face of hardship and resilience. This wasn't a policy dictated from the top down. It was a spontaneous, grassroots movement of human empathy. Soldiers, many of whom had fought in the Pacific and had witnessed the ferocity of the Japanese military, now found themselves in a position of power, and they chose compassion over contempt. They began to see the Japanese not as fanatical warriors, but as civilians, men, women, and, most poignantly, children who had endured the same hardships of war, albeit from the other side. The American occupation was a two-pronged effort: the official, high-level political and economic reforms, led by MacArthur's headquarters, and the unofficial, day-to-day interactions between American soldiers and the Japanese populace. It was in these seemingly small personal exchanges that the foundation for a new relationship was laid. Soldiers started to frequent local black markets, not to exploit the system, but to trade their cigarettes and rations for Japanese goods, and in doing so, created a form of economic assistance. They shared their food, not just with children, but with entire families. For the Japanese, this was a radical departure from everything they had been taught. They had been told to prepare for brutality, but they were met with generosity. This unexpected kindness created a deep sense of cognitive dissonance. The enemy was not behaving like an enemy. This was particularly true for the children. They were the most open to this new reality. Unlike their parents, they had not been fully indoctrinated with the militaristic ideology of the empire. They were shaped by their immediate needs and experiences. The American soldier who gave them a piece of chocolate was not a monster. He was a kind stranger. Over time, these interactions evolved. The soldiers started to learn a few basic Japanese phrases. The children began to learn some English. Simple games were invented. Baseball, a game virtually unknown in Japan before the war, became a common sight in the rubble-strewn parks, with GIs teaching Japanese boys how to swing a bat and throw a ball. For the Japanese children, these American soldiers were not just a source of food. They were a source of normalcy and joy in a world that had been anything but normal for so long. They were a connection to the outside world, a glimpse into a different way of life. The psychological impact of these small acts of kindness was immeasurable. For a population demoralized by defeat and suffering from a collective sense of shame, the empathy shown by the American soldiers was a powerful balm. It helped to restore a sense of dignity and humanity. It told them that they were not forgotten, that they were not merely the faceless enemy. The official occupation policy of democratization and reform was important, but without these personal connections, without the trust that was built on a foundation of shared food and a few friendly words, it might have been met with far more resistance. The soldiers were the true ambassadors of a new peace, their actions speaking louder than any official proclamation. The story of James, Kenji, and Emmy was just one among thousands. In the months that followed, their relationship deepened. James, whenever he could, would bring extra rations to the children. He became a familiar and welcome sight in their neighborhood. He saw the children's faces fill out, their smiles become more genuine, and the light return to their eyes. But this era of goodwill was not without its challenges. There were still vast cultural and political divides to bridge. The wounds of war were still fresh, and as the occupation progressed, new tensions and unforeseen conflicts would arise, testing the fragile peace and the nascent trust that had been so carefully built. What would happen when the initial outpouring of goodwill faded? What happens when the harsh realities of rebuilding a nation, with all its political complexities and economic struggles, began to overshadow the simple acts of human kindness? The initial honeymoon phase of the occupation, marked by a wave of American generosity and Japanese relief, could not last forever. As the months wore on and the occupation settled into a routine, new tensions and frictions began to emerge. The sheer scale of the task, rebuilding a country from scratch, was immense, and it brought with it a host of new challenges. The food scarcity, while somewhat alleviated by American aid shipments, remained a critical issue. The black markets, which had once been a lifeline, now became a source of widespread corruption and inequality. The official currency, the Japanese yen, was devalued, and a new black market economy flourished, making it difficult for ordinary people to purchase even the most basic necessities. American soldiers, with their plentiful supply of cigarettes and rations, had an unfair advantage in this new economy. While many continued to share, others became part of the problem, using their goods to take advantage of the desperate situation, trading them for services and goods at exorbitant rates. This created a new kind of resentment, a subtle undercurrent of animosity that threatened to undermine the initial goodwill. The cultural divide, too, proved to be a source of misunderstanding and conflict. For the Japanese, the concepts of honor, shame, and collective identity were deeply ingrained. The open displays of affection, the casual camaraderie, and the individualistic attitudes of the Americans were often seen as baffling or even disrespectful. Conversely, the Americans often misinterpreted the Japanese's reserved nature as being cold or ungrateful. The language barrier, though some progress had been made, remained a significant obstacle. Simple misunderstandings could escalate into complex problems, and the lack of communication often led to frustration on both sides. James, the young GI who had formed a bond with Kenji and Emmy, found himself navigating this complicated new world. He was a symbol of hope to the children, but he was also a part of the larger, sometimes problematic, American presence. He saw the resentment in the eyes of some of the older men, the ones who had lost everything and saw the American presence not as a helping hand, but as a daily reminder of their defeat. One day, a small incident brought this tension to the surface. James was walking through the neighborhood with Kenji and Emmy when they were confronted by a group of older Japanese men. The men, their faces gaunt and their eyes filled with a simmering anger, started to shout at James, their words a torrent of frustration and grief. They saw him not as an individual, but as a representative of the occupying force that had brought so much destruction. They accused him of taking advantage of their desperation, of flaunting his wealth and power in the face of their poverty. Kenji, who had been holding James's hand, let go. His face, once so full of trust, was now a mask of confusion and fear. He looked from the angry men to James, the old lessons of his father clashing with the new reality he had come to know. James, unable to understand the words, could feel the hostility. He looked at the men, his heart sinking. He wanted to explain, to tell them that he was just a boy from Kansas who wanted to help, but the language barrier was a wall, and the emotions were a raging river. The standoff was broken by an unexpected voice. It was Emmy, the little girl, who, despite her small size, had an enormous spirit. She walked up to the men, her small body trembling, and said something in a voice so quiet that James couldn't hear it. But he saw the effect it had. The men fell silent. They looked at the little girl, and then they looked at James. The anger in their eyes began to soften, replaced by a deep, profound shame. They had been reminded of what was most important, not the politics of war, but the innocence of children and the simple act of human kindness. The incident passed, but it left a lasting impression on James. He realized that the task of building peace was far more complex than just sharing a few rations. It was about overcoming deep-seated hatreds and fears, and it required patience, empathy, and a willingness to confront the painful truths of the past. The black market, the cultural misunderstandings, and the lingering resentments were a constant reminder of the fragility of their relationship. The road to true peace would be long and arduous, and a single act of kindness, while powerful, was not enough. They would need more than food to heal a broken world. They would need a shared vision, a common goal. But how could two nations, so different in their histories and their values, ever truly come together? The challenges of the occupation did not go unnoticed by General MacArthur's headquarters. While the initial focus had been on demilitarization and political reform, it became clear that a humanitarian crisis was a threat to the entire reconstruction effort. Starvation and disease were rampant, and the black market's corruption was creating social instability. The simple, grassroots acts of kindness by individual GIs, while powerful, were not enough to address the systemic problems. A new policy was needed. A large-scale, coordinated effort to feed and heal the Japanese people. The program was called LARA, the Licensed Agencies for Relief in Asia. It was an international effort, but a significant portion of the aid came from the American people who, hearing the stories of the Japanese people's suffering from their sons and brothers in the occupation force, began to donate money, food, and clothing. This was an unprecedented act in the history of warfare, an enemy population being fed and clothed by their former adversaries. But it wasn't just about food. It was about restoring a sense of normalcy, of dignity. Schools were reopened, and American GIs were often found teaching English or playing sports with the children. Medical facilities were established, and doctors worked tirelessly to combat outbreaks of disease like typhus and cholera. The American Red Cross set up centers to provide medical aid and relief supplies. For the Japanese, this was the ultimate proof that the war was truly over, that the Americans were not there to destroy them, but to help them rebuild. The stories of James and the children, and countless others like them, became a powerful narrative, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, human compassion can triumph over hatred. The relationship between the GIs and the Japanese children became a symbol of this new era. The children, free from the ideological baggage of the previous generation, became the bridge to a new future. They were not afraid of the Americans. They were curious. They saw them not as conquerors, but as guests, as teachers, as friends. They were the ones who truly embraced the new culture, the new language, and the new possibilities. James, now a familiar and trusted face in his neighborhood, became a de facto ambassador. He continued to bring rations, but now he also brought books and pencils. He helped the children learn to read and write in English. He taught them to play baseball, and in return they taught him the intricate art of origami and the simple beauty of a Japanese folk song. Their small corner of Tokyo, a patch of rubble and broken dreams, became a pocket of peace and cultural exchange. The experience changed James as well. He had arrived in Japan with the preconceptions of his time, with the wartime propaganda still fresh in his mind. But the kindness he had witnessed, the resilience of the Japanese people, and the bond he had formed with the children had fundamentally changed him. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a peacemaker. He realized that the war had not been a simple battle of good versus evil. It had been a complex tragedy with victims on all sides. He had learned a profound lesson about the nature of humanity, about the power of empathy, and about the importance of seeing past the labels of enemy and friend. But as the occupation progressed and the children grew older, the time for goodbyes was fast approaching. The American troops would eventually be rotated out, and the GIs who had formed these bonds would return home. How would the children react to this second, more subtle abandonment? Would the seeds of peace they had planted be enough to last? And what would happen to the relationship between the two nations when the men who had built the bridges of peace were no longer there? The end of James's tour of duty was a bittersweet moment. He was going home, back to Kansas, to his family, and to a life he had once considered normal. But a part of him would forever remain in the ruins of Tokyo, in the laughter of children playing baseball, and in the quiet, grateful smile of a little girl who had once been on the brink of starvation. The final day was a blur of emotions. He gathered the children, now a familiar sight, one last time. He gave them the last of his rations and the few remaining supplies he had managed to collect. He said his goodbyes to Kenji and Emmy, his voice thick with emotion. Emmy, no longer the terrified little girl, gave him a small, perfectly folded paper crane, a symbol of hope and longevity. Kenji, now a young boy on the cusp of adolescence, looked at him with a maturity that belied his years. He didn't say much. He just bowed, a deep, respectful bow, a gesture that spoke more than words ever could. It was a thank you, a farewell, and a promise that the kindness would not be forgotten. James returned the bow, a gesture he had learned from them, and then he turned and walked away, not looking back, his heart heavy with a mixture of sadness and hope. He knew that their friendship, born from the ashes of war, was a fragile thing. It was a beautiful memory, but would it endure? Decades passed. The ruins of Tokyo gave way to a modern metropolis, a vibrant city of skyscrapers and neon lights. Japan rose from the ashes, an economic powerhouse, a nation of peace and prosperity. The children of the occupation grew up, raised their own families, and built a new country. The story of the GIs who had shared their rations became a legendary part of their collective memory. It was a powerful reminder that even after a war of unimaginable brutality, humanity could still triumph. Kenji and Emmy, now adults with children and grandchildren of their own, never forgot the young American soldier who had offered them food when they had nothing. The memory of the chocolate bar, the peaches, and the gentle face of James Thompson was a powerful formative experience that shaped the way they viewed the world. The seeds of peace planted in the cold winter of 1945 had blossomed into a profound and lasting friendship between two nations. The American and Japanese peoples, once mortal enemies, became steadfast allies, trading partners, and cultural collaborators. The small acts of kindness, the shared rations, and the games of baseball had been the building blocks of this new relationship. But the story was not quite over. Decades later, a young man from America arrived in Japan on a student exchange program. His name was Thomas. He was the grandson of James Thompson. He was there to study Japanese culture and history, a world his grandfather had often spoken about, a place he had helped to rebuild. On his last day in Tokyo, Thomas visited a small museum dedicated to the post-war occupation. As he was leaving, an elderly man, his face lined with the wisdom of a long life, approached him. The man, a museum docent, looked at Thomas, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "You have your grandfather's eyes?" the old man said in fluent, if slightly accented English. Thomas was stunned. "My grandfather? How do you know?" The old man smiled, a profound, gentle smile that reached his eyes. "I was one of the children," he said. "My name is Kenji." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn, perfectly folded paper crane. It was the crane Emmy had given to James all those years ago. It had been passed down through generations. He looked at Thomas, his eyes filled with gratitude and a lifetime of memory. "We never forgot what he did," Kenji said. "He gave us more than food. He gave us hope. He taught us that peace was possible." The two men stood there. Two generations, two cultures, connected by a single powerful thread of kindness that had been spun from the raw fabric of war. It was a beautiful, poignant reunion, a testament to the enduring power of compassion. But the story's final twist was still to come. Kenji looked at Thomas and, with a subtle movement of his head, gestured towards a woman standing a short distance away. "This is my sister," he said. "Her name is Emmy." Thomas looked at her, and in her eyes he saw a reflection of the same profound gratitude and the same unspoken story. She had her own memories of the boy from Kansas, memories that had shaped her life in ways he could not possibly imagine. But the real surprise was yet to be revealed. Kenji and Emmy had a secret, a final part of the story that had never been told, a debt of gratitude they had been waiting a lifetime to repay.